I was 21, home from college for the summer, and staying at my childhood best friend Olivia's house for a few weeks. Her dad, Mr. H., had always been kind to me, like a second father. He was charming, successful, and honestly looked younger than his age. I thought nothing of the late night kitchen chats or how he remembered every little thing I'd told him years ago. But one evening everything changed. We were alone. Olivia had gone out, and her mom was traveling for work. I came downstairs for tea, and he was already there. We talked, laughed, and I noticed he was different. His compliments were unusually intimate. Then, without warning, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "I think I'm falling for you. I know it's wrong, but I've felt this way for a long time." I froze, my stomach dropped. He kept talking about how he hadn't felt emotionally connected to his wife in years, how he admired my intelligence, my maturity. He said he hadn't touched his wife in months, and that our conversations made him feel alive. I didn't know what to say. I just muttered I should go to bed, and practically ran upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. For days I kept it to myself. I couldn't look Olivia in the eye. I felt like I was carrying her father's secret against my will. Part of me was furious. How dare he say that? Another part of me was heartbroken. I remembered all those moments he confided in me about his loneliness. I realized I had unknowingly become his emotional affair. I eventually confronted him and told him he had crossed a line. His expression turned cold, almost defensive, like I was the one who had misunderstood. That moment changed everything. I never told Olivia. I couldn't. The guilt of keeping that from her still lingers. Emotional entanglement in the context of infidelity is often more complex and damaging than physical betrayal because it taps into the foundational elements of trust, vulnerability, and personal connection. When a person in a position of trust, like a best friend's father, crosses emotional boundaries, it triggers a web of conflicting emotions that are difficult to untangle. In many real-life scenarios, infidelity doesn't start with a kiss or a secret rendezvous, but with long conversations, inside jokes, or a growing sense of emotional dependency. These seemingly harmless moments gradually evolve into something deeply intimate, surpassing even physical connections in intensity. Emotional infidelity builds quietly. It's the emotional energy that gets invested in someone outside of a committed relationship, energy that should belong to a spouse or partner. In the story of a best friend's father confessing his feelings, this dynamic is magnified by the inherent power imbalance and trust that exists in the relationship. The emotional betrayal begins with attention, subtle at first. Compliments, concern, shared glances, long conversations at night when others are asleep. These are the building blocks of an emotional affair. When this attention comes from someone like a best friend's father, it carries an added layer of confusion. There's admiration, respect, and even a kind of familial affection that can be misread or manipulated. For the person receiving that attention, the emotional complexity is often overwhelming. They might feel special, validated, or guilty for enjoying the attention, even though they never sought it out. This contradiction makes emotional infidelity particularly difficult to define or confront. The boundaries start to blur as the person confessing their feelings begins to treat the emotional bond as something exclusive, secretive, and personal. The relationship shifts from casual familiarity to an intense form of closeness that isolates the two from others, especially from the person's actual partner. In many cases, individuals engaging in emotional infidelity convince themselves that they aren't doing anything wrong because there's no physical intimacy involved. But that belief ignores the emotional labor, the secrecy, and the psychological shift that redefines loyalty and attachment. For the recipient of such a confession, like in the case of the young woman hearing those words from her best friend's dad, the emotional impact is profound. Suddenly, she's placed in a position where she must reckon with the weight of someone else's emotional needs, desires, and confessions, none of which she asked for. These emotionally charged situations are especially complicated because they violate multiple layers of trust. There's the betrayal of the spouse or partner, of course, But there's also the betrayal of friendship, family, like bonds, and the inherent power dynamic between an older adult and a younger person. The person who confesses feelings like the father in the story often does so because they feel neglected, misunderstood, or emotionally isolated in their own relationship. They may not set out to cause harm, but they still act selfishly, prioritizing their own emotional gratification over the emotional safety of the person they involve. They turn a person who might be decades younger and emotionally vulnerable into their confidant and object of affection. This emotional shift places tremendous psychological pressure on the recipient. Emotional infidelity rooted in such situations often leaves lasting damage because there is rarely a clear path toward closure. The relationship doesn't implode in an obvious or dramatic way. Instead, it lingers in awkward silences, avoidance, and a creeping sense of guilt or shame. The person who hears the confession is left to navigate their feelings in isolation. They carry the emotional burden of someone else's needs, often while trying to protect others. Like a best friend, from pain, there's also the risk of being blamed or misunderstood if the truth ever comes out. This silencing effect is a key reason why emotional infidelity in close personal circles, especially involving authority figures, is so insidious. Emotional entanglement in infidelity reveals the fragile, often invisible lines that define trust and loyalty. These lines are easily crossed not through grand gestures, but through shared vulnerabilities, meaningful conversations, and the simple but profound act of being emotionally present for someone else. It's a slow unraveling, but once it happens, the emotional fallout can be just as destructive as any physical affair, if not more. Betrayal wrapped in silence is one of the most emotionally damaging forms of infidelity, particularly when it occurs in the context of trusted relationships. In situations where emotional boundaries are crossed, such as when a best friend's father confesses romantic or intimate feelings, the betrayal does not always explode in a public confrontation. Instead, it festers in private, creating an emotional prison for the person who holds the secret. This type of betrayal is unique in that it isn't just about romantic loyalty being broken. It involves layers of trust between friends, family, and even the perception of what is safe and stable. Silence becomes the shield and the weapon used to protect others from pain, but also to protect the confessor from accountability. It's a betrayal that walks hand in hand with guilt, confusion, and the unbearable weight of knowing something that could shatter multiple lives if spoken aloud. When someone confesses inappropriate feelings, especially someone older, trusted, and closely connected, it often paralyzes the recipient. The first reaction is typically shock, followed by disbelief, and eventually fear. Fear of what might happen if they tell someone, fear of destroying friendships or breaking up a family, fear of being blamed for leading someone on, even when there was no intent. This fear turns into silence, and that silence quickly becomes a cage. The person carrying the secret begins to withdraw emotionally, often distancing themselves from both the confessor and the person they're trying to protect, like their best friend. They may start to question their own actions, doubting if they gave off the wrong impression, wondering if they were too friendly, too open, too available. This internal interrogation only deepens the emotional damage because it shifts responsibility away from the person who crossed the line and puts it on the one who was caught off guard. The pressure of secrecy can alter the dynamics of relationships irreversibly. In many real-life stories, individuals who are forced into silence after a betrayal begin to exhibit signs of stress, anxiety, or depression. They're constantly on edge, afraid that someone might sense something is wrong. Every interaction with the confessor becomes a minefield. Every word, every glance, every memory a source of discomfort. And yet, they pretend everything is fine, preserving the facade because the alternative feels too destructive. This kind of silence isn't peaceful, it's suffocating. It prevents closure, healing, or even the possibility of truth being acknowledged. The betrayed person becomes emotionally isolated, living with knowledge they never asked for and responsibility they never agreed to carry. Silence also creates an imbalance of power. The person who confessed often feels relief. They've shared their feelings, unburdened themselves, but they have transferred the emotional fallout to someone else. Meanwhile, the recipient is left to manage not only their own reaction, but also the ripple effects it could have on others. In the story of the best friend's father, the confession isn't just about forbidden affection. It's about dragging someone else into an emotional conflict that should never have included them. The power dynamic shifts completely, with the younger person forced into an adult emotional dilemma far beyond their maturity or willingness to navigate. This imbalance is rarely acknowledged, but plays a crucial role in the trauma that results from such betrayals. What makes betrayal and silence so toxic is that it never fully goes away. Even if the relationship with the confessor ends, the memory lingers. The recipient of the confession may carry resentment, shame, or guilt for years. They might struggle with future trust, always wary of hidden motives or unspoken expectations in their relationships. And perhaps most painfully, they may continue to feel as though they betrayed someone they loved simply by not speaking up. The silence becomes a part of their identity, an invisible scar that complicates every future bond. This is particularly painful in close-knit settings like families or lifelong friendships, where the betrayal doesn't just disrupt individual connections but threatens entire emotional ecosystems. Real, life stories of emotional betrayal often reveal that silence is not chosen lightly. It's usually a survival response, born out of a desperate need to protect others, maintain stability, or avoid blame. But over time, the silence transforms from protection to burden. It erodes confidence, distorts memories, and creates a quiet internal chaos that's hard to explain to others. The person who holds the secret feels like they are living a lie, not because of something they did, but because of what they know. This emotional conflict, the loyalty to truth versus loyalty to people, lies at the heart of betrayal wrapped in silence. It's the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but instead whispers in the background of every conversation, every reunion, every moment that could have been simple, but is now tainted with the weight of what was never said.